Our first speaker is Stan Karp, and Stan is the director of the Secondary Reform Project for New Jersey's Education Law Center. Stan taught English and journalism. As those of you who have ever had the pleasure of having him edit something of yours know, he does it really, really well. But he taught high school students in Paterson, New Jersey for 30 years, starting at the ripe age of 15. He is also an editor for Rethinking Schools, where he is keeping all that good stuff coming and informing us. So Stan is going to lay out the overview on this very important issue and share some of his wisdom. And I forgot to mention, each of you will be timing yourselves, I assume. So we're going to go about 15 to 20 minutes. So let me turn it over to Stan.
Thank you, Julia. It's good to be here. So this session is alternative to standardized testing, and I was charged with, hopefully when I'm done, Anne and Karyna will be explaining how we can get out of the mess, and I was charged with explaining a little bit about how we got into the mess of over-testing and misusing standardized testing in schools. At the bottom, if you can see the slide, you have my email. If you have any questions or questions about sources or anything that I say today, please feel free to reach out. Let's see. So the origins of standardized testing is actually a topic that I think we should do more teaching about in our schools. We should be talking to our students about where the tests that they're taking originally came from, especially at this moment in our history when so many assumptions and basic premises of how things work in our society are up for reconsideration. People should know the history of how these tests came to drive so much activity in our schools. The origins of standardized testing are not very pretty. They began with racialized notions of intelligence and intelligence testing that was not really about assessing student learning, but was about legitimizing race and class privilege as merit, and that used various forms of measurement to kind of reinforce privileges that existed in the larger society. Louis Turnman is a name in Stanford who's associated, a Stanford professor who was associated with the expansion of testing and measurement systems that were used during World War I, like the Army Alpha test to sort and label people as they were brought into the Army, and to advocate for the application of those methods in public schools. In the 20s, the SAT began. Carl Brigham from Princeton famously developed the SAT to identify defective strands of the population, and these were then transferred to school uses to kind of control access to college and determine access to various kinds of programs. And then also in the early 1900s, when large numbers of immigrant students start to come into large city high schools, tracking and ability grouping policies were adopted that were also facilitated by the use of standardized testing. And again, this was not so much assessment of learning as it was measurement of a certain kind of whatever the quality that was called intelligence was, but was actually reinforcing various kinds of privilege that were reproduced then by the institutions that use these instruments. So in our current era, the test, what's called the test and punish era, because of the way that standardized tests have been used to punish the people who don't score well on them. There are a number of landmarks on the way to the development of this era in testing and in education policy. In 1983, there was a famous report, national report issued under the Reagan administration that gave rise to the state standards movement, the urge for states and the mandate for states to develop curriculum standards, which in turn led to the development of testing to assess those standards. There are also the use of the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is sometimes called the nation's report card, which in many ways is a useful, it's the oldest data set of student test performance available. It is also not used in most cases. It's forbidden to be used in the way that many high stakes tests are by law, cannot be used to assess or label individual schools or individual teachers. But one thing that was done in the 80s is the proficiency levels on NAEP were set unrealistically high at a level that no real schools have ever met. And that results in the great majority of students who take NAEP getting a label as not proficient. Even the states that typically perform the best, which is usually New Jersey and Massachusetts, more than half the kids don't pass the tests. And this is not a sign of their competency or proficiency. It is a sign of where the levels have been set. Excuse me. So a test can produce almost any result you want, depending on how it's constructed. And most tests most standardized tests that are used in schools are constructed in a way that large numbers of students will not be successful. This method of assessing learning got a tremendous boost in 2002 when the bipartisan No Child Left Behind Act was passed, which mandated a big extension of testing in schools, and also was a landmark, a sea change in federal education policy. Historically, federal education policy had been about expanding equity and access by supporting things like school integration, greater funding for poor schools with Title I, and rights for students with disabilities. After No Child Left Behind, the focus of federal education policy became much more about labeling schools, rating teachers, rating students in a way that had a very test and punish effect. In 2009, under the Obama administration, the race to the top, and Arne Duncan, his education secretary, unfortunately doubled down on this, extending test and punish to evaluating teachers on the basis of test scores, and even giving out federal funds on the basis of having states adopt these policies, and also using test scores to close schools and to replace them with charters, privatized charters, or various forms of private management. Around this time, Common Core also was rolled out. The two main Common Core testing consortia got hundreds of millions of dollars to develop tests. Their theory of action was that since many millions of students were not passing current tests, the solution was to give harder ones. This was the wrong answer and did not work, and also led to a tremendous pushback against the overuse and misuse of standardized testing. Again, NCLB mandated annual testing of every student in every grade every year from grades 3 to 8, and once again in high school. Before that, many states did what they called grade span testing, where they would test once in elementary school, once in middle school, once in high school. There were about 19 states, only 19 states before NCLB tested all students every year. After NCLB, it was all 50 states. You had to do it to get the federal funding that they needed. A study by the Council of Great City Schools in 2015 found that in big city school systems, the average urban student was taking 112 tests in their pre-K to 12 career by the time they graduated high school, and it was just completely out of control. 16 states had test-based grade promotion policies. 27 states required exit testing for high school diplomas. 43 states used test-based teacher evaluation in some form, again, kind of compelled to do that by race to the top and the NCLB waivers. There also began to roll out test-based ratings of teacher ed programs. So even college programs were rated on the basis of the test scores that their graduates produced. The inability of this, or the negative results of this, were very predictable. Social scientists and activists became very familiar with this law formulated by the social scientist Donald Campbell in the 70s. The more any qualitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it is to corruption pressures, and the more apt it is to distort and corrupt the social processes it's intended to monitor. And that is an excellent and very depressing capsule description of what standardized testing has done to teaching and learning in many places. It has created a narrative of public education failure. It's moved teaching and learning decisions away from schools and educators, moved them to bureaucracies and politicians. It's narrowed curriculum. It's degraded instruction to kill and drill in many places, often to the students who need the most enriched activities in order to engage with their education. It's been used to close public schools, promote charters, mayoral and state takeovers, private management. It is directly fed the school to prison pipeline. Exit testing has been especially one of the negative impacts of that. There was a study by the Economic Policy Institute that indicated that schools with really hard exit tests could increase incarceration rates by as much as 12%. Teacher rights and unions found themselves weakened, and there were cheating scandals. High stakes produces high stakes manipulation. There were cheating scandals in over 200 districts in a dozen states. Fortunately, what it also created was a tremendous resistance and backlash, an opt-out movement from parents and students and teachers that reached hundreds of thousands of students and parents. Teacher unions and professional associations pushed back against the basis of this, helped to promote legislation that narrowed it. There was a rollback of high school exit testing, which was simply not feasible to fail so many kids who weren't passing those tests. So today we have about 13 states. Unfortunately, New Jersey is still one of them, although we've been working on that for some time. The two testing consortia associated with Common Core have both pretty much collapsed. PARC is gone. SBAC is at a much lower level of impact, although these tests are still around in various forms and still being used in ways that are reflective of the history of standardized testing. Test publishers have reached all kinds of crisis, both business plans that aren't work and credibility plans, from endless errors in the testing and the management of the tests has really reduced the credibility that they have with both educators and parents. There's been a tremendous growth of test-free college admissions policies. Currently, half of all the four-year colleges in the country are test optional for admissions, which means they don't require students to use SAT or ACT scores to get in. And over 1,200 schools are now on fair test lists of schools you can apply to without submitting standardized test scores. In 2018, we also had a tremendous wave of teacher protests, teacher strikes, which really changed the landscape of education politics in this country, changed the focus from tests and charters to school funding and teacher salaries, two places where investment can make a difference. One of the problems with all the investment in standardized testing is it really has done nothing to reduce the inequalities and the lack of opportunities, which are reflected in the scores, but are not addressed by giving more tests. This all culminated in a really amazing moment soon after this pandemic spread, when Betsy DeVos, our current and very unpopular Secretary of Education, took what is undoubtedly the only popular action she has ever taken, and that's to grant a waiver to all 50 states who sought a waiver to not have to implement the mandated ESSA federal test for 2020. As a matter of fact, one of the first lessons of the pandemic was how irrelevant these tests are to the education of our kids and how much they are an obstacle to serving our students. And so it was immediately swept away. One of the few good things that happened in the last couple of months. To the point where, in terms of testing, I should say, because there were many amazing things that have happened in the last couple of months. This got to the point where Monday, when I was putting these slides together, this was the feature headline in the Washington Post column by Valerie Strauss, the answer sheet, talking about the beginning of the end of America's obsession with standardized tests. I urge you to go take a look at it. Among other things, it has a summary of a proposal from Fair Test about how we might move forward from this point, which begins with renewing the federal test waiver. States should be applying for this. I know we will be pressing the department in New Jersey and the governor, who actually campaigned on a sharp reduction of this testing, to extend this waiver for 2021, and to end the use of these tests for all the punish aspects of testing: the grade promotion test, the exit exams, the course placement, the bonuses, the job ratings, the rating systems that get printed in school report cards, all based on test formulas. We should also limit state testing so that it's just the minimum of what's necessary until we can change the federal law. We should ban state testing, standardized testing, before grade 3. We should greatly increase transparency and enhance oversight of these tests, require publication of their questions so people can review them, and a look at the studies about their validity, because so many tests are not used for purposes to which they've actually been proven to be valid. But we do need assessment. Parents do need information about their student learning. Kids need to know how they're doing. Teachers need assessment. Schools need to be accountable to the communities they serve. And so we need other tools. And so however much we push back against testing, we also need to develop and implement performance-based assessment systems that support good teaching, support academic quality, and support equity. And one of the most successful performance-based assessment systems has been the New York Performance Standards Consortium, which Ann Cook has helped to found, and which a good time to turn it over to Ann and to talk about where we might go and make sure we don't go where we have been.
Great, thank you very much, Stan. That was terrific. Okay, so as Stan noted, our next speaker is Ann Cook, who is the Executive Director of the New York Performance Standards Consortium, and she's going to share some of her wisdom with us. She's also a co-founder of New York City's Urban Academy Laboratory Public High School, a board member of Fair Test, which is very relevant to today's topic as well, the National Organization for Fair and Open Testing, and the author of a just reissued series of 6 stories for young readers called Meet Monster.
Identified some schools that were doing some interesting things, and he, when those schools went to him, he had them coupled with schools that were struggling. And one of the things that he noticed about these schools that included Urban Academy, included Central Park East Secondary School, he noticed that they used a system of assessment that was very different than relying on the Regents exams. Before that, a lot of the schools that were high-performing schools used the Regents exams, and they were actually tied to state scholarships. So kids who did well on these exams got money to go to the state colleges and so on. So Tom noticed that these schools were interesting, and he said, well, these assessments that they're using, maybe they could use them for something else. And he gave these schools an opportunity to start to try something different. And one of the things he did that was very smart was that he gave a waiver to these schools, and he put a little proviso into the language of the waiver, which said that these schools should be allowed to develop these performance assessments, and the state should allow them to go forward, and they should review them after 5 years and see if they worked. But of course, he knew that as a state commissioner, he knew that it was probably unlikely that they would follow through. And so he put a little proviso that said, if the state doesn't look into these schools and doesn't evaluate them, it should still go forward. And that was a very lucky little sentence that went into the original waiver, because along the way, especially starting in 1998, the state ed department wanted to get rid of anything that wasn't the Regents exams. And that protected the schools that had already started to really develop a language and a way of working with them. So we began very simply by trying some ideas out, and we said, well, learning's complex, assessment should be too. And we began to develop ways to look at kids, at student learning that didn't involve a one-day, one-time test. And we linked them. We said one of the things that was very important to us was that the assessments would grow out of classroom work. They weren't going to be something that we wanted to know. What did kids, could they show us that they knew and what that they could do? Not what somebody else or some company thought they should know. What was it that, so these things would grow out of topics that would crop up in classrooms, and students would begin to really get engaged in them. And we began along the way to develop rubrics, and we can go to the next slide. Are you able to do them, Julia? Let's see if we could switch over. Yeah, switch again, keep going. Okay, so we developed some consortium-wide tasks and rubrics and ways of looking at reliability. We got engaged with our schools in professional development. We tried to figure out what were some of the, clearly if you weren't teaching to a test, you were trying to figure out how to make learning more inquiry-based, more discussion-based, and then trying to figure out how that would be reflected in the kinds of topics that students would get interested in. Okay, let's go forward. And people always ask us, well, who are the kids? We now have 36 schools, and the numbers, everybody wonders, how do you become a consortium school? We do not regulate the numbers. It's done by the Board of Regents. And it's kind of part of our history as to how we established approval from the Board of Regents. But they control the total number of schools that are in the consortium. So who are these schools? Who are they? You can see we have more kids of color than the city as a whole, more English language learners, more kids with disability, more kids in temporary housing. Kids coming in from the 8th grade are lower performers than the city average in both math and English. And we have a higher economic need index than the city as a whole. Okay. So there are certain qualities or attributes about the consortium that we want to really try to make sure we have in place. Obviously, opportunities for kids to demonstrate what they know and can do. Multiple ways to express learning, so it's not only one way. A lot of feedback on kids' work and really a culture of revision. So I think most of these kids would know that a 5-paragraph essay wouldn't satisfy, that you'd have to really revise your work. And at the end of the process, when you're about to graduate, there's an oral defense. And by the way, that is not, that should be an S for defense, but it's corrected by an English program, UK program. Okay, so we try to get open-ended questions and open-ended, in-depth investigations, and really try to help the kids understand what it means to have an evidence-based argument. So we're interested, for example, in you can go forward. We're interested in problem solving. We're interested in, obviously, students having evidence of critical thinking. There's a lot of emphasis on research, both in particularly the social sciences and in the science tasks that they do. There's collaboration in terms of learning, but the actual PBATs, as we call them, the performance-based assessment tasks, are done individually. And the communication skills come through a lot of opportunities for kids to present their work. What are the tasks? So we'll look at them a little bit more thoroughly in the next slide. There's math, which you can see. I can direct you to the website if you want to look and see what it looks like. The math, we've done a lot of work around revising the math curriculum to make it much more, less based on, more based on problem solving, having kids really take on interesting math problems and work them through, even if it takes a long time. So there's a lot of modeling and a lot of work. You can look at the rubrics, which we'll see in a minute, and see what are the things that we're actually interested in them participating in. Social studies, we're interested in text-based research, and then they have to write an analytic paper in history or some aspect of the social sciences. This is for graduation levels. In literature, they have to do a literary analysis. And in science, they have a choice. They can do an original science experiment or an engineering project or design. And those are the requirements, and they are across the whole spectrum of schools that are range from schools in the South Bronx, in the poorest neighborhood in the country in terms of the socioeconomic background of kids in the South Bronx, to schools that are in middle-class communities. So we have a range of students. And the tasks, they can choose what they want to do, but the rubrics that you will see in a minute are standardized across the schools. There are also supplemental tasks that schools add on. We have a number of international schools where students are in the schools because they have come to the country less than 4 years, they've been in the United States less than 4 years, and they have failed the English language proficiency test. So from there we have a set number of those schools. We also have a number of transfer schools where students have started at another school and it hasn't worked for a variety of reasons, and they come to one of the consortium schools. And those schools will add on additional, what we call PBATs, the performance-based assessment tests. So there are schools that add on creative arts, there's schools that add on world languages, internships, and those also are part of schools' graduation requirements. The 4 that you see in yellow are required of every school, and schools can then adjust what they want to do with the others. So the system, the next slide shows you what the rubrics, we have system-wide criteria for looking at student work. And these rubrics are used to evaluate the student work. They're developed by subject discipline practitioners who are teachers, and they are revised usually every other year. Sometimes there's major changes, sometimes they're not, but they're meant to really assess what it is that we're expecting kids to be able to do, and how do we assess the work. Are we assessing the work in a way that is reflective of the kinds of skills and attitudes and ways of thinking that we want kids to have when they graduate? And then twice a year, and now it's even more because we do it in the schools, we have what are called moderation studies to try to establish reliability. We bring together 180, 200 teachers on given days, and they get packets of papers, not their own. They regrade them. They not only regrade the papers, they regrade the tasks that were established to produce the papers. And, you know, we didn't do this in the beginning. We just looked at student work. And I remember one occasion, some of the teachers were reading one of the papers and they said, you know, this is a very good mediocre paper. So what is that? And what they meant was it met all the criteria of the rubrics for looking at student work, but the question that the student was asked to really was working on, or that had been focused on, was not as rich as it could have been. And so we began to look at the tasks. We use Norman Webb's depth of knowledge to look at as a lens looking at the tasks. And then that information is fed back to the schools. So we're trying to look to see if schools have said something is outstanding, and we think it's not that outstanding, or sometimes it works the other way. But usually we're looking for comparability. and ways of looking at the papers that, since we're all using the same rubrics, what is it that we can see? Because the students can pick topics, even within a class, that are different from one another. So the content is not what we're looking for. We're not looking for them to learn a particular body of knowledge. What we're looking for, as you see in the next slide, I think, is these are the rubrics, which are hard to read on here, but if you go to the website, you'll see what we're looking for. For example, in the social sciences, we're looking for viewpoint, and what's the thesis? Is it clear? We're looking for evidence and sources. We're looking for analysis and persuasion. We're looking for organization. And keep in mind that whatever papers the students would be producing or work would be judged by more than just a teacher. There's a committee. And then they would be, every student would be assessed orally. So they would present their oral presentation. If you go on the website, you'll see a science PBAT, an oral defense. You'll see a math defense. And there are, for the math defense, very often we will bring in outside assessors. That is, they're never graded by their own teacher. So they're people that they don't, that are not teaching them. And these rubrics are, as I said, they're used across all of the schools. I think the next one that you'll see is the math. So in the math, we're looking for the performance indicators would be things like problem solving, reasoning and proof, communication, connections, representation. It's much less of an emphasis on procedural math, more on modeling, on proofs. And I think you'll see, I'd encourage you to look at the film on the, well, there are a couple of films on there about math. Well, one of them is a boy, a student defending his math proficiency, his math PBAT. And he's being questioned, and the questions that they're being asked are not just on the work they've done, but what's their ability to actually apply what they know to some other situations which they're not familiar with. So people say, well, okay, how do you assess all this? And we look at, first of all, we're looking for a number of things. We're looking at how they do on, a student would be assessed on this, but as a school, we're looking at graduation rates and college readiness, and we're looking at different, I'm going to switch the next slide, yeah. So we're looking at the kids going to college, what percentage, the minority, particularly minority male college data. We're looking at some indicators of teacher professionalism. Retention is very important to us, and also follow-up interviews with graduates. One of the things we found when we began doing this interviews with graduates is that kids would come back from college after a semester or 2 semesters and so on and talk about their writing assignments in particular. They get so much practice writing. I mean, writing is one of those things, they just have to keep doing it, and there have to be reasons why they want to write. And so you just find that kids have a great comfort really in writing papers. They'll talk about, I have a roommate who went to a Regent school, and they were really nervous about writing papers, and I didn't have any of that problem. We got that over and over again from graduates. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on revision in what they're writing. So again, it's not writing a paper, handing it in, and that's it. It's much more part of a process. I think that what we find when we look at the data, you can go to the next one, that the schools are clear what they're trying to do. I think we were all on remote for the last 3 months. And I think what was really interesting was the number of kids. As Stan mentioned, that during this period, a lot of states just had to give up the testing. They did. In New York, the Regents exams were just canceled. And a lot of the schools were kind of at a loss as to what to do, because that was what kept the kids going. at the consortium schools, kids said they wanted, we were prepared to give up, for example, part of the PBATs because, you know, that kids had a lot of issues around the technology and the devices, et cetera. And a lot of the students said, no, we want our defense. We want to finish our defense. So, you know, schools really felt that there was a culture in the schools that was there was a lot more engagement on the part of students and ownership of what they were doing. And that kept a lot of the schools focused on meaningful work for the students. So I think there's more of a sense of why are we doing this? And we're not doing it for someone else. This is really more something that we're committed to doing. And a lot of, and I think the other thing you found was that these schools have a kind of nimbleness and kind of ability to bring on new things as a situation unfolded. So, for example, one of the schools in social studies, they put all the kids together and they developed a sort of team system. They had debates that they had 90, 100 kids on a debate about things like, should people be fined for not social distancing? You know, they plugged into what the issues were. They created a law, they suggested to the kids that Congress was about to pass a law that said that everyone from 17 to 40 had to become an essential worker at some point. So that, and they were debating this, is this a good idea? You know, so that, and then when the protests started, it very quickly in most of these schools moved into civil rights issues and really trying to help kids figure out where they were in what was occurring outside the school. So there's a great deal of commitment to cultural relevance and I think much more of a commitment to finding topics and themes and units that connect with things outside of the present, but also trying to really make things have a sense of relevance that's important to the students. So what does it look like when you look at the data? So let's look at some of the four-year graduation rates on the next slide. I think you'll see the consortium schools are, this is taken from DOE data and state data. There's a higher graduation rate. And keep in mind that we have a lower entry point for the kids when they come in. So there's if you look at the kids of color, they have a higher graduation rate, a higher rate for English language learners, and kids with disabilities. That's across the consortium. If you look at the next slide, there's this is taken from data that the DOE collects about academic targets that they set, student achievement. You can see credit accumulation by grade 9, 18-month college enrollment, and 4-year college readiness figures that are comparative between the consortium and the city figures. So the next slide. And these are, this is a quality review is something that the DOE does with teams of people going into the schools. Actually, they rated this at 100%, and I said it looks fishy. They put it at 98%. You know, I'm always at a loss to explain some of the data that comes out of the department. So anyway, I think these are taken from surveys that the Board of Ed conducts in all the schools across the city. So for us, I think it's not, in the next slide, it's not just about the about performance assessment. At least for me, it's more, I'm mostly interested in we all know that any kind of assessment affects school culture. In many ways, it's a bad effect. In some ways, we hope it's good. And one of the things that I think I'm most interested in is that this kind of assessment promotes inquiry-based instruction. It's much more likely to get teachers trying to figure out how to ask good questions, how to get kids talking, and discussion becomes much more of the a part of the instruction. Kids go into depth, they become experts at something that they care about, and so it supports in-depth curriculum instead of more wide, you know, sort of a whole, the sweep of American history. I think there's much more of an encouragement of student voice and discussion. And I think ownership is critical, that students feel they own the topics, and you can tell that when you hear them talk about it in their defenses. And I think equally important is that it helps to create professional communities. And we do a tremendous amount of professional development. One of the things we've discovered is that by putting schools together, we have what are called exchanges. We mix teachers in certain disciplines from different schools. And they meet, they visit each other's classrooms, they sit in on each other's PDATs. They act as outside assessors for external assessors for some of the oral defenses. And I think what you find is it really helps to create a professional community within the schools. So it's sort of, that's a quick overview of how we operate. One of the projects that we took on about 5 years ago, that you'll hear about from Karyna, is that we meet with various groups in the schools. So we meet with the social workers. We have projects that the social workers are doing across schools. And about 5 or 6 years ago, we had a meeting with the college advisors in our different high schools. And we sort of tried to take the temperature of what's happening, where are kids going, how successful are they? And one of the things that flagged was that we were getting students into private independent colleges, four-year colleges, and also state universities, but we were not getting kids into the four-year CUNYs. And it was because the four-year CUNYs, to get into those schools, you needed SAT scores that were above what a lot of our students were getting. And that was not just, by the way, true of our schools, it was true across the city. And the Community Service Society did a big study. They found out that this was true across the city. And so we started a pilot where we tried to convince the CUNY admissions office to accept students based on partly their PBATs instead of their test scores, looking at their PBATs and their GPAs and their references and recommendations instead of just their SAT scores. And over the years, it's been very successful, I think, and we're going to hear about it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And that was terrific. I'm glad we could get the sharing to work.
Okay.
Let me unshare you. So thank you. So our final speaker is Karyna Pryiomka. Karyna is a doctoral candidate in critical social and personality psychology, PhD program. She's drawing on the history of psychology and the philosophy of science. I guess that's the underpinnings of the program. Her personal research interests include the relationship between psychological assessments and educational policy, validity theory, and the qualitative-quantitative divide in social science research. Karyna brings these interests in a blend of critical and digital pedagogies into her teaching of research methods courses at the City University of New York. So Karyna, do you want to upload your PowerPoint? And I know Michelle, I think, is on as well. Michelle's still here. Michelle Fine. I just want to give a shout out. Michelle's the one who actually brought this panel to us, and then unfortunately she wasn't going to be able to participate. And then of course we got the pandemic, so all kinds of.
I'm supposed to be in Australia. Yeah, I'm glad to be here and listening.
Very happy to have you. Thank you. So Karyna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for having me here, and I am very happy to and privileged to follow the presentations of Stan and Anne, because my work builds directly on their work. And what I am going to talk about is really a case study, a evaluation of the CUNY Consortium pilot. And my talk is based primarily on the upcoming report that Michelle and I co-authored that is scheduled to be released on July 2nd. And of course, the link will be available. And there is also an accompanying webinar where you can hear the CUNY admissions perspective. We have the Associate Director of Admissions and Recruitment speaking at that webinar, talking about their side of the project and how they engage with student materials and PBATs and the work. So what I'm going to do is, this is a very preliminary descriptive report. So I'm going to show some results, but also walk you through our analytical reasoning, because I believe in this moment where, you know, we are facing a lot of challenges, we're also facing a lot of opportunities, and some of the limitations and difficulties that we're facing with our analyses can really be rapture points for starting to rethink how we think about outcomes, testing, assessment, and things like that. And so my talk is focused on the context of college admissions and success in college. And as Stan outlined, there is a changing landscape in admissions and placement policies. We see more and more institutions and researchers challenging the predictive validity of traditional standardized tests, rethinking admissions, thinking about more holistic test optional admissions, but also rethinking remediation and course placements, thinking about co-requisite models, thinking about using already available student data for placement, doing self-placement, and foregoing additional testing, such as Accuplacer exams and other, often even less reliable internally developed exams. And so, as Anne pointed out, the CUNY Consortium grew out of the concern that after CUNY changed its admissions requirements, fewer students of color and consortium students were accepted into CUNY's four-year colleges. And it's a collaboration on many levels. It's an inter-institutional and intra-institutional collaboration. And we're happy, Michelle and I are very happy to be a part of it. And we are conducting this evaluation with the support of also the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment that shares their data with us so we can conduct some of our calculations. So very briefly about CUNY, for those of you who are not familiar, it's a city-level system, very robust, 25 colleges, 275,000 degree-seeking students. It's been consistently rated in the past few years as one of the top public colleges for social mobility. And so it's an economic and educational engine of the New York City. Our pilot sits as a separate one among many kind of initiatives among CUNY in CUNY to reimagine college access. So the typical admissions process, there's one application for all schools, and the application component includes SAT and ACT scores, regions, and other student backgrounds. There is a central review, and primarily at that stage, the central review looks at whether students meet individual criteria set out by individual colleges. Some colleges at CUNY are more selective than others or have different requirements. And then campuses are ultimately making the final decision. The CUNY Consortium pilot is a separate initiative where the office performs a holistic review. And students submit PBATs, teacher recommendations, and a more robust application. And the admissions office, as Joanna Kucharski explains in our other webinar, is really advocating for the students. They're conducting very close review of student materials. Students do not meet the cutoff SAT score requirements for regular admissions in four-year colleges. And so the admissions office, the team really advocates on behalf of the students. And then again, the campuses make the final decision. And so out of this collaboration, we are looking at two primary research questions at this stage. How do students that are educated in the consortium with performance assessments fare over time in terms of college persistence, GPA, and credits accumulated compared to other CUNY students? And how do students in the consortium CUNY pilot who fail to meet CUNY's minimum requirements fare in terms of the same outcomes? So we're kind of looking at two different things here. We're looking at the predictive validity or value added of consortium-based education model, And then the interaction of that model with the holistic assessment, right? What happens when we, you know, completely take away the college, the standardized testing out of the equation. So as I said, I'm going to speak of this more as an evolving process. I'm not going to make any bold conclusions, and I'm going to echo Diane Ravitch in her plenary. We're going to make modest claims and very patiently build our evidentiary support for this. So our source, like I said, our data source comes from the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment. Our population, we're currently focusing only on 3 cohorts of students. Those are 2015, 16, and 17 cohorts. All of the students are full-time freshmen, and all of the students have entered college without delay. Again, this is a very limited population. We know that the population of college-going students is changing rapidly. We have more adults entering, more students entering after taking years off, you know, after college, high school, for various reasons. So this is something to keep in mind. And we're not doing any fancy calculations here. If we don't have access to certain variables, we exclude those students from our analysis at current stage. No fancy missing data computations or anything like that. So that's, again, something to keep in mind. So some of the ands might look a little weird from table to table. I apologize for that. So let's look at the admissions profile. So we're looking at consortium non-pilot students, New York City public students, and consortium pilot students. For New York City public students, we're excluding specialized high schools because of their super selective admissions process. So we felt like it was unfair to include them in the broad sample at this stage. We do see that consortium non-pilot students and New York City public students have comparable high school GPAs, but do have lower mean SAT scores on average. And when we look at our pilot students, we have that they do have higher high school GPA, but even lower SAT scores, because that's one of the requirements of the pilot, right? They don't, their test scores are usually even lower than, you know, the threshold for admissions. So with that in mind, we're first going to look at a kind of a broad view. So we're currently focusing on first semester GPA, credit accumulation during the first semester, and retention within of 1 year within CUNY. So students can transfer from one college to another, but they're retained within the system. So we do see that pilot students generally outperform both of their consortium peers and New York City public high school peers on all 3 measures: their first semester college GPA, their likelihood of earning 80 or more of attempted credits during their first semester, and their 1 year retention within the system. We do see that non-pilot students have comparable GPAs and very slightly lower credit accumulation and retention. And I'll talk a little bit about how that sits in terms of some of the limitations of our data. But this is a very broad view, and as Anne pointed out, there is a lot of variability in both the student characteristics and school characteristics that exist in New York City, you know, among consortium schools and other schools. So what we're trying to do is trying to disaggregate the data, looking at some other variables. And so we looked at the same outcomes for students from underrepresented minority groups. And here I mean Black students, Hispanic, and Native American students. So we do see that the GPAs, and I apologize here, we look at pilot and non-pilot students combined, because once we disaggregate, because the pilot is small, we're running into some data security issues. So here we're going to talk about the kind of combined group. We do see, again, comparable performance as measured by average GPA within the first semester. We do see comparable retention, and we do see, again, very slightly lower credit accumulation. So despite the fact that their test scores are on average slightly lower at entrance compared to other students. When we look even deeper, we see specific gains actually for Black men. As you can see, our ANDs dropped significantly. Unfortunately, Black men are one of the most underrepresented groups at CUNY and higher education in general. But we do see that students of this group who graduated from Consortium and attended CUNY do tend to have higher GPA on average and higher retention rates within the CUNY system. So we're starting to see that there are some interactions among student level variables and the kind of curriculum that we need to explore further. We're also not blind to the fact that there are school level outcomes and school level variables that are important. And so using the DOE data, publicly available DOE data, we were able to kind of classify the schools based on their demographic outcome. And we looked at the performance of students who graduate from schools with greater than 70% of where the greater than 70% of student population is classified as economically disadvantaged. And we do see that the 1-year retention within CUNY of students who graduate from these consortium schools is actually higher than the retention rate of students who graduate from New York City public schools with the same level of students classified as economically disadvantaged. Although overall, on average, we see comparable rates of retention among schools. So here is another kind of opportunity for us to start thinking, how can we build in school level variables and think about the interaction between, you know, the school resources, the types of students that enter the school, and how their outcomes and their curriculum play out and help students in their college success. We are, however, facing some limitations and next steps. And I would say that at this stage of analysis, as it's very preliminary and descriptive, it's good to talk about them in conversation with each other. We have small and uneven sample sizes. Obviously, the pool of students who attend CUNY from New York City public schools is much larger than Consortium and, of course, the pilot. So we need to figure out a way to, you know, implement statistical controls to create more comparable comparison groups. We also struggling with data availability, and that speaks directly to our ability to speak meaningfully about what are the differences that we see in outcomes actually mean. For instance, we cannot say which courses or majors our students are taking or pursuing, which means that we might not be able to equitably interpret what do their GPAs really mean. I don't know if you heard, Paul Atwell just released a paper about the significantly lower GPAs in STEM majors and how that specific pattern of grading can deter students from pursuing those majors. But also you will see on average lower GPAs for students with more demanding majors and more demanding courses. Unfortunately, we cannot look with our current data at course taking patterns of students. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. And also for those of you who might be undertaking these similar projects, this is something to consider. Another possibility and another limitation in addition to about thinking about longer term and different outcomes is also grades, right? Again, we only know that whether students earned the credits that they attempted or not. We don't know whether students withdrew or failed their courses. And as we see more and more conversations around factors and characteristics like grit, right, mindset, control, smart decision-making, strategic thinking, you know, the soft non-cognitive skills playing into and contributing to outcomes, we might interpret, you know, failure and withdrawal from the course very differently, depending on how strategic is the student thinking about their choices, right? Are they recognizing that they have overtaken credits and now they're, right, withdrawing because, you know, they are self-aware and understand their limitations? Or are they sticking with the course and showing grit despite earlier, you know, kind of lower outcomes that they have experienced? And of course, selection bias. We only looking at consortium students who are attending CUNY, who are choosing to attend CUNY. And as Anne pointed out, many consortium students are accepted to other schools. And so what factors into their decision to attend CUNY schools, and what might be the differences between consortium students who attend CUNY schools versus who choose to go to other colleges and universities might also, again, explain a lot of the differences that we may or may not see in our analysis, but this is something that we are very aware of, that that's one of our limitations. And so kind of echoing back Stan's and Anne's point about complexity, I think that holistic admissions and inquiry-based high school education really have potential to improve access to quality education for many underserved students and close equity gaps, and also force us, many of us who are college instructors, to think about how conditions have we become and how much our teaching and assessment in college level courses contributes to the vicious cycle of testing, right? Was a lot of instructors forced to go online, right? How much are we going to shift to more testing in college level courses? How much of real performance assessment are we conducting in college level courses? And how do these practices factor into these reliability loops that we sometimes create? Again, Consortium CUNY pilot is among many initiatives, and it's showing very promising results. And again, as Joanna told us, is really helping the admissions office to rethink their practices and think more deeply about how to move away from testing and how to incorporate more holistic assessment across the board. And of course, there are many issues with that, labor issues, right? Funding issues, and but also, again, echoing Stan and Anne's presentations, in a current historical moment, as painful and hard it is, we really have an unprecedented change to rethink and reimagine opportunities and take new ideas to scale. And by scale, I don't mean one size fits all. I'm really, really skeptical when people say scale, meaning now we force everybody to do the same thing, right? But in scale, meaning that more institutions have an opportunity to experiment and rethink rather than just retweak what they have in place and think critically about the role that standardized testing plays in their admissions, but also in their curriculum and pedagogical practices at the level of higher education. And that is it for me.